Now call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. It's my great pleasure to rise to speak on the Family Assistance and Other Legislation Amendment Schoolkids Bonus Bill 2012. Let me start by telling the House that this is bad legislation. This bill before the House is a desperate, crude, blatant cash splash designed to win votes. There is no productivity outcome for the Australian economy. There is no positive educational outcome for kids at school. And there is no dividend in terms of job creation and investment in Australia. That's why we oppose it. And we oppose it because it replaced, or it was planning to replace, a perfectly viable and effective scheme, the education tax refund. The education tax refund, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, was based on parents with school-aged children at primary and secondary school providing receipts at the end of the financial year. They then received reimbursements for those particular educational-related expenses. It was such a good scheme that the Coalition took to the last election improvements. We took to the last election policies to expand this particular dividend. In fact, if you go to our election policy under the title Real Action Plan, Reducing the Pressure on Families, it talks about how the Liberals will increase the education tax rebate. It says that we will have increased the maximum rebate to $500 per year, up $110 per year for every child in primary school. That same document said that the Liberals and the Nationals, the Coalition, would increase the maximum rebate to $1,000 per year, up $221 per year for each child in secondary school. What is more, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, we were planning to expand the eligible expenses for the rebate so that it included government and non-government school fees, special education costs for children with disabilities like dyslexia, camps and excursions, musical instruments, extracurricular school activities such as music, sports, dance and drama lessons, tutoring costs, sporting fees and equipment and school photos. This is a targeted scheme, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. This is a scheme that would put money in the pockets of parents who had primary and secondary school-aged children. They would provide receipts. This encouraged responsibility in our system. Instead, we have this proposal before us in this Family Assistance and Other Legislation Amendment Bill, particularly designed to cushion the impact of the carbon tax. This is not an education-related expenditure. In fact, this government is so embarrassed by its record on education, the fact that it believes that a $1 billion cost blowout on its computer in schools program means better educational outcomes, the fact that this government believes that spending more than $15–16 billion of taxpayers' money on overpriced school halls leads to better educational outcomes, they were wrong on both accounts. The fact that this government commissioned the Gonski Review to look at how to improve educational outcomes in our schools and has done nothing in this budget to meet the recommendation of David Gonski and his committee. Instead, they have rebadged this cash handout the Schoolkids bonus. How ridiculous is that? There's nothing that is linked to school outcomes. This is just a desperate bid for votes. You tell me, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, what is the connection between handing out cheques for $800 odd for secondary students and $410 for primary students, but with no receipts, with no commitment by the parents that that money will be spent on education-related expenses? They've got rid of that responsibility and that accountability and that viability and that transparency in the current system. Instead, they've replaced it with this desperate, blatant splash for cash, cash for splash, whatever way you like to put it. It's a bad outcome for parents, it's a bad outcome for taxpayers, and it doesn't produce the educational dividend. But what would have produced a better educational dividend, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, is the policy that we took to the last election, designed, as I said, to increase the maximum rebate for parents with students at primary and secondary school, and designed to expand those particular eligible expenses for the rebate. That would have produced a better educational outcome. So why has this government done this? Why are we having this legislation thrust upon us the morning after the budget? I'll tell you why. Because Australia is about to face an economy-wide carbon tax, which is the biggest in the world. If you go to the United States, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, there's no cap-and-trade system. If you go to Canada, their Prime Minister, a Conservative, just won the biggest election victory in over 100 years, campaigning against a carbon tax. If you go to China, they're increasing their emissions by 500%. But if you go to Australia, you've got a Labor government which wants to burden every taxpayer and every household with higher cost of living expenses through a carbon tax. And I can tell you from my own experience in the electorate of Kooyong that parents and households are worried about this. Small business is getting desperate and they know they are not going to be compensated. That is why this government has decided, through this fictitious bill called a Schoolkids bonus, to hand out money to parents with no link to educational outcomes. I will tell you, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, about the dry cleaner in Cotham Road, Kew, who employs 4 people. He works 6 days a week. He's seen his electricity bills rise, and now it's going to rise another 10 to 12% on July the 1st this year with the carbon tax. He does not know what to do in order to recoup those expenses. He can't lift his prices because that will see a fall in his trade, but he can put off a worker, and that won't be good for the economy. He can't work any harder because he has a family and he works 6 days a week. Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, I'll tell you about the self-funded retirees in my electorate that are under the age of 65 but have an income of around $30,000 that went to the government's own website to see what compensation they get under the carbon tax. And they got nothing. They're over $200 out of pocket, worse off every year through the carbon tax, but they do not get compensation. Under this carbon tax, this government's going to be spending $3.5 billion on offshore permits by 2020 and $57 billion of taxpayers' money on offshore permits by 2050.
Order.
In my electorate, can I tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, the education...
The member for Kooyong will keep his remarks relevant to the bill
I
before the House.
Absolutely am staying relevant, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. The reason why I'm talking about the carbon tax is because this is the motivation for the bill that is before the House right now. This is not an educational-related bill. This does not produce better outcomes for parents and their students who are their children. But it does produce a cash bonus for their pocket, which won't be necessarily used on educational outcomes. And the reason, Mr Deputy Speaker, is because of the carbon tax. That's the only reason. And you know that, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker. You know that there is no job creation about just giving a handout to parents with school-aged children. In fact, this government saw when it gave, last time it gave cash bonuses during the GFC, that I think 16,000 dead people received their $900 bonuses. How many ineligible people will receive this cash bonus? Instead of the current scheme, which the Coalition strongly supports, which is all about giving parents money after they have spent the money, after they have spent their own hard-earned dollars on education-related expenses, and they provide the government or the ATO with the receipts at the end of the financial year. That's the current system. That was the system that we were in favour of improving. But instead, this government is designed to remove that existing system so that it can cushion the pain and the blow of the carbon tax. And I can tell you that Deloitte's have done studies that have found in my own state of Victoria over 23,000 people will lose their jobs. Jobs will not be created. Billions of dollars will be sucked out of the economy. I've told you about my own experience with small business and self-funded retirees. They're not going to get this cash bonus, this fictitious school kids bonus, but they will be paying higher cost of living expenses. In fact, this measure, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, this family assistance and other legislation amendment school kids bonus, is part of a rotten budget. It's part of a budget that has forecast an increase in unemployment to 5.5%. It is part of a budget that has ripped more than $5 billion out of defence. It's part of a budget which insufficiently supports the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's part of a budget that has lifted the debt ceiling from $250 to $300 billion, 4 times the amount that existed under the Howard government. It's part of a budget that has told us that last year's budget deficit has ballooned from $22 billion to $44 billion. That's why this mechanism, this education mechanism, this school kids bonus is so wrong, because it is part of a broader budget which does fail Australian families. A budget which abolishes the company taxes for small and big business. A budget that makes people pay more for aged care. A budget that will see Australia's debt rise to $145 billion, including an interest bill of $8 billion a year, $22 million a day. If you want to provide better educational outcomes like Mr Gonski was talking about, Mr Gonski was talking about an extra $5 billion. Well, hang on, isn't the interest bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the Australian taxpayer now $8 billion, the cost of an NDIS, the cost of 5 teaching hospitals, the cost of real education changes? That's how you get education changes, by putting the budget in the black, not by running up massive deficits. In fact, the 4 largest deficits in the history of the Australian nation have come the last 4 years under Wayne Swan, a total of $174 billion. In fact, one of my heroes, Margaret Thatcher, a reformist Prime Minister, said the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. And that's what we're seeing from this government. That's why I'm against this cash handout, this cash splash, which is a desperate bid for votes, because it is not designed to boost productivity, it's not designed to create jobs and encourage investment, and it's not designed to improve educational outcomes. We want to go back to responsible fiscal management, and we want to look after those students who are at school whose educational outcomes we care about.